Alright, we are recording. So this video is going to be a little different, and I'm going to try to do these going forward, even though there's part of me that recognizes their stupidity, let's say. I'll explain that. But let me first explain what this is. So as it says up there, Dolmen Frame Time Statistics and Graphs. The key for Dolmen, which is a game I've most recently reviewed, was provided by Tinsley PR for Prime Matter. And, excuse me. So, not too long ago, from my perspective at least, I wrote up the performance analysis for Dying Light 2. One of the things that I did with that was I also debuted this applet that I've made here, which allows for interactivity with the statistics and graphs that I typically use in performance analysis or review in this case. And at the moment, serving up this applet so that you can just like go to a website and interact with it, not exactly the easiest thing, just there's certain limitations on the hosting. And also for just a review, I'm not sure how useful it is, so I figure instead I will just go through it in a video, showing off the different things, doing the interactivity there, and highlighting certain aspects of it that we can see in the data with this. So what we're looking at right here are just the tables currently, which they're not complete. Normally I would in an article have all that there. For now though, we're not going to worry too much about those extra values. Just the mean and the 1% extremes should be enough. And also the 60 FPS value, especially since I'm looking at means well over 100 FPS. 60 FPS is, we don't need lower than that. We can go higher though. You can see how it looks at 90. 120, 144, which I think are all appropriately common, at least concerns. 90 isn't really a common refresh rate, but 120, 144 hertz isn't too bad. And those are quite common. And also, just for reference, these are the machine. This is the specs for the desktop that I collected this data on. A Threadripper 1950X, and this is with a here it is. The RX 580 8GB Pulse, Sapphire Pulse, stock. I don't have any overclock or undervolt applied to it. At one point, a driver update invalidated the undervolt, so I just haven't bothered trying to find it again. And so yeah, as we can see, 60 FPS, it handled it fine. This is the epic configuration. You cannot turn up the settings more for this. All I had to do was turn off VSync, and these were the numbers I was getting for these two locations. The dump main path, that's actually the name of it. That's the area that I was in, and Wasteland, the deposit. And both of these I ran for 5 minutes, as is my usual. And by ran, I just mean I went along them. I actually tried to walk. You can run the game. I decided to walk to control the time a little bit better. The main path is kind of inside of a cave. Multi-level cave, but still kind of inside of a cave. So somewhat limited, closer, definitely. The deposit, you actually do have walls up on either side, but it's still a bit broader. Funny thing is, I would actually think that the main path has more geometry and such I needed to deal with, but as you can see, the mean was much, much better there. And, yeah, and we can also see, with these values that clearly the Wasteland also was a bit harder than the dump was. Now it is also true though, the dump, the lighting might be easier there because it's internal. So there's not really like shadows being cast. For the Wasteland though, enough of that is outside, so you do have the shadows being cast. So that might be making some difference. Oh, and for anyone that is seeing this and doesn't know how I work with this stuff normally, I actually do it all in frame time. It's like a last step is converting it to FPS, which is why the 1% values for the FPS are very high. It's because it's the 1% lows in frame time and then the 99% highs. So there is actually more I want to do here, but I need to show the graphs first. And actually we can kind of see it here, but let's just go to a graph. It'll make more sense. So this is a summary graph. So the height of the bar is the mean. The center line of the box plots is the median. And everything else for the box plot is actually custom. Normally it would be the lower quartile and upper quartile. This is set to be 1%, 99%, and then 0.1%, 99.9%. and similar over here. We don't see it so well here. Here we see it. This looks pretty bad. I mean, it looks like there's a lot of variability along here. Thing is, when I saw that in the graph, because that was like maybe half an hour after, after I got everything, situated and such, like maybe half an hour after I looked at the graph from, collecting data, and it's like, that was not my experience. Not even close. Which means that I want to do this. Normally it goes a little transparent here. It just hasn't done that at the moment. To let you know it is redrawing these graphs, but it is doing it. Oh wait, no. Wrong control, sorry. That one. There, so now it redrew it, and we'll also redraw the course once we get there. I forgot I still had the UI for controlling the tables. So the tool I use, OCat, it is using presentmon as the base, and it collects a lot of data. MS between presents, I refer to it as frame time. That's what most people refer to it as. But we're going to use the MS between display change. I call this the display time. And it's a lot more consistent with what I actually experience. And I do generally consider display time to be more representative of the experience than frame time, but usually they're very, very near each other. So they're not really interchangeable, but you could almost use them interchangeably. So working with just frame time is fine. But not for this game. No. I mean, you could see, I'll go back. Right here, 60.78 for the 99% long frame time to 88.14 FPS. That is far and away better. And when we look at the graphs, you will see there as well, the display time is far and away better and is a lot closer to what I actually experienced. So we look at this, it's going to have to redraw itself. And there's a lot of data here, so it'll take a little bit of time. But you'll see that basically all of that will disappear. See? Except for right here, which that would actually be frames being dropped. That's why they're down at 0. I could have a filter to get rid of those, but I don't want to remove any data. But you can see this is much more consistent. We do have some curiosities here. This is obviously also a curiosity, so we can take a closer look at that. So yeah, that looks actually really bad. That looks like a lot of stutter. But I do think it would be most accurate to say it's because it was dropping a frame and then taking a long time, or actually taking a long... Actually, no, we can see. Let's see if I'm getting that a bit tighter in. Might be better if I just type it in. Okay. Yeah, so it actually did first drop a frame, then draw a frame, then drop a frame, then draw a frame. So it was going back and forth like that until about in here. Then it had another frame in there. So it was long frame, normal, drop, long frame, drop, long frame, drop, long frame, normal, drop. So yeah, that's not good. I am not sure what that would have been caused by. But fortunately, it's 3 seconds over 300. So this is 1% of the data we're looking at. Actually less. Actually less than 1% of the data, because this whole width here is about 3 seconds. And we can see, this data here. The mean was still 115. Now, true, that is for display time, not frame time, but it's still generally pretty close. So yeah, this is still very good. And yes, these stats are just for this section. Now let's take a look at this. See what's going on here. Okay, so this actually could be just something from how the game engine was behaving, where like suddenly I was looking at something, it's like, oh, this is easier to render, so it improves, but then I turned back. Brief like a single frame stutter, and even then that you might not even know, is that is still so close to 120 FPS, or half the refresh rate cycle, where the cycle is 1/60th of a second, because that's my display is a 60th display. But you can see over here, it's 8.33, that's 120 FPS, or 120 hertz. But yeah, so this is very likely, because of how regular that is, I looked at something, looked away, looked at something, looked away, and it was just going back and forth between that with a very small, I doubt I'd even notice it, I doubt you'd even notice it, hitch at some of the transition. So, not at all something we need to worry about. It just happened. This is the only one that looks like might be kind of weird. But I honestly, I don't remember performance ever being that poor. But even then, it's like the red line is 60 FPS. So it's very fine. How it was, I mean, look, the 99% value was about 55 FPS. We're good. We're good. We don't need it. All right, so now let's look at the frequency plots. The reason it changed is it was showing the frame time initially. So we'll just do that and let it already draw. This one's actually very fast, so I might have missed that. Oh no, it's still showing display. Oh, I'm doing it again when I'm on the wrong control. So that's the frame time graph. And actually this can kind of show you how typically very close they are. It just like cleans up a little bit. But you saw that the overall shape and placement was the same between them. All right, so yeah, I mean these are actually looking very good. We got a lot of the data centered in right here. Let's so that's the upper limit here is at about 6.2, so that corresponds to 160 FPS. So that's about right there. That's quite good. And in this highlight is 98.48% of the data. This is very good result. And if we look here, we can see some noise in there. That's only 0.67% of the data, so we don't have to worry. Look at this, and let's actually see. So there's 0.21% of the data at the zeros. So that's 0.21% of the frames were dropped. That's pretty good. It would be better if none of the frames were dropped, but this is display time. And that, I don't necessarily work with display time too often, but it does stand out to me when I have worked with it. That is where you will see 0 because frames being dropped, and you don't necessarily see that with frames. If you look over here, these long frame times, 0.2. So these are actually reflections of each other. In fact, they're very, very likely these. Actually, yeah, because we only see the zeros right there. So that's those the reflections here are those spots. So we do not have to worry about that. And we now also know that it is in total 0.4% of the data. Well, 0.4. But yeah, so we don't need to worry about that. And the shape of this is actually pretty good. It is always a little interesting to see these little like secondary peaks in here. But I have a feeling that this might partly be because there was just so much data that and also like I was just in certain regions. Because yeah, you do actually really see different locations along that path that I used here. So it is actually very possible that this is like just what the peak would be, the distribution would be for one area. But I collect so much more data than just that we also get this peak. It might also be a peak here and peak here. And sometimes that's just how that goes. And same thing here, where it just because I collect for such a long time, 5 minutes, I can get multiple areas in there, and they don't always coalesce into one neat peak. But it's still that this is pretty good. We're looking at very good performance. How tight is this? 5 milliseconds. That's pretty good. I'd be quite happy with that. I am quite happy. All right, now we're going to look at the QQ, which this is still frame time, so this is going to redraw itself. There we go. And again, we see down here, we see the frames that were dropped and the long frames here. So, I'm just trying to decide how I want to tackle this. Okay, let's look back at the tables for a moment. So, let me turn on all these. So all these points here, all these values here are in this graph. We've got the median, 0.1% low, 1%, 99%, 99.9%. Here's the median, that's the 50th percentile. 1% low, 0.1% low, 99% high, 99.9% high, okay? And these rectangles draw out those connections. And these theoretical lines, they connect from the 1% low to the 99% high, and we can actually change that. let's actually do that. So right here, we could probably go to about 0.2. And what do we want to go to over here? About there. 99.7. So do that. Has to redraw the graph, but it's going to redraw theoretical lines. Going to give us new slopes as well. This is one of those... Oh, I have that just a little bit off. So let's do 0.25. So I'm trying to get the theoretical line to follow... There we go. That's much better. To follow the bulk of the data here that does not include the outliers. These are definitely outliers. These are definitely outliers. I might be able to push this out a little bit higher, but as you saw, 0.05% of the data is enough to completely throw off the line. So, and also we now have new, additional boxes being drawn out. So I'm not sure. Huh. It's very hard to make out. Oh yeah, duh, because this rectangle down here is at 0. That's why you can't really make it out. I was trying to look for it up higher, and it's like, no, that's not there. You can see this extra one here, and this extra one here. And we have slopes of 0.04 and 0.05. So the lower that slope is, the better, because that means that the data was more consistent. And what this translates to is, we are in, we actually should be using this scale for considering the slope. So that would be 0.05 milliseconds per percent. And we're spanning quite a bit. And what's the difference here? About 99.5%. So multiply that out, and you get the idea of how much the actual range is between these. But yeah, so it's actually quite good. In fact, we can even do this. 5, 99.7, and now they're added to the table here. So we're going for one of them from 184.47 FPS to 95.24. And if we look at it in the millisecond, and yeah, I'll turn off the others, make that a little bit easier. So 5.54 milliseconds to 9.5 basically. So a swing of about 4 milliseconds there, and a swing of about 5.2 milliseconds there. Not too bad. So that we don't need to really see the zoomed in thing here. I do want to come back to this for the frame time. I do want to show that to you, but I want to cover the other graphs first. I want you to see how much a difference. I mean, I showed it to you on the course graph, the difference between frame time and display time. It's even more exaggerated here just by the nature of how this shows the data distribution. But I want to get over to here. This is the frame time graph, and yeah, that looks really bad. But wait for it to redraw, and it will look so much better. There we go. Now, unfortunately, because I kind of have this set to the 40 FPS, it looks a little wonky. It looks very stretched. But it still is. You could tell. And I could just change it. It's just I can't change it per graph, so I'd need to... It would force a redraw. But yeah, so you can see this is actually really good. I mean, there's very, very little vertical, so that's very little difference between the display time for one frame and the next frame. A lot of the data is in a very tight area there. We do have these wings, but we can do this. And yeah, about like that. So that rectangle holds 98.18% of the data. That's pretty good. That is pretty good. And that is going from negative 0.8 to 0.92. Let's just say plus or minus 1 millisecond. What that is saying is that for 98% of the data, okay, the difference between, the difference from one frame to the next was within 1 millisecond, plus or minus 1 millisecond on it. So a range of 2 milliseconds in total. That's very solid. That is very solid. And here we can just pull that out a little bit further. I'm not going to be able to send it very But yeah, it's still very solid. And if we look at this one, we'll see the dropped frames and what that did. So every time there was a dropped frame, the very next one was much longer, taking us to about, well, 17 or so milliseconds, which is longer than one frame, one refresh cycle. So these points, the very next value was over here, somewhere in this group. Okay, and then these, because they're somewhat, well, they are negative, just how negative are they, would then come back into this. Not entirely sure where these would have gone. I mean, it's like we have these, the next values would have been less than this, so that they would have had to have mapped up to here, to the tip here. All right. And if we do this again to get a sense of how much data is in there, 99% of the data is in this range. And again, it's about plus or minus 1 millisecond. So very good stability there with regards to the display time. And here, we can change the frame time here. Get a look at these absolutely horrendous, and I just remembered I shouldn't have done that because I still have these graphs I want to look at. Which actually, that graph, I'm not going to include the static version, the image, in probably any review. It's the units are a little bit different between these two, and that's all. But these, because they're absolute units, I think that's better for using static image. Whereas this is, it's more relative, but I think that's still very useful. Okay, so you can see here, it's just the frame time. So same exact data, technically, I collected it at the same time. It's just now it's a different measurement. So now if you look at that, the heat map is only holding about 80% of the data. And it's also a much wider range there. So this really, really shows the difference between frame time and display time. That can occur. It doesn't always have to be there. A lot of games, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. Here, this game, you can tell them apart. But most games you wouldn't be able. No, you would not be able. Yeah. Actually, I'm not sure. I might not want to redraw. So the difference between this graph and this graph is right here. So now it is showing as a percentage of whatever the frame time is. The reason why I am doing that is because if the impact of a longer frame, of a greater difference between one frame and the next, it's going to depend on what your actual frame time is. So if you have a difference from one frame to the next of, say, 4 milliseconds, that's about 25% for 60 FPS, but it would be 50% for 120 FPS, so it's more likely to have an impact. So what I did here is these values are now still the consecutive difference, but it's now that difference divided by whatever the frame time is, or display time if I just change the unit. But divided by that real time, that real measurement, in order to tell us, relatively speaking, what was that percent, how much longer was the next frame, or shorter was the next frame, compared to the current frame. Come on, you should be redrawing down there. Ah, there. It just took a little bit. It's a lot of data. It's a lot of points, so it can take a while. I think this one, the main path, was like 7 meg CSV. Which is pretty big for what I work with. Do that. This is spanning 15% of the data here vertically, and it's about 84. Sorry, it's spanning 15% for the consecutive difference. Well, 30% in total, plus or minus 15%, and spanning about 84% of the day. Not 48, that'd be very different. But change that to the display time, and it's going to clean up just like the other did. But yeah, so because of it being the percentages there, that should mean then that values that would be closer to 0 over here are now going to be further away. I mean, right here you can see that these values, we'll just need to wait for it to redraw, were about here. The points were about here. Come on. Come on, finish rendering so I can show the people that I'm right. Yep, right there. but now it's almost off the graph. Now, true, it's only 110. If I change that to 120, which corresponds a little bit closer, but 110 I think looks better. It's a lot of data, and it's also having to calculate the difference at the time of. So it's actually still, even outside of that, but it still is. We do this, you'll see it's like 96, 97% of the data, and it's within 20% plus or minus of whatever the current frame. So yeah, very good stability that we. So let's come and look at this. And I should also explain how this graph actually works. Because the consecutive difference graph, I think, is easier to explain than this one even. Just because it's very simple. It's like one axis is the actual measurement, is the frame time measurement, and then the other axis is the difference from one frame to the next. It might be weird to try to visualize exactly what that means, but you can understand what those terms are. QQ plots, those are different. Those are very different. So basically what it's doing is it's sorting the data from least to greatest, and then is plotting it on the percentiles. The thing is, well, actually, not quartiles, quantiles. So it's a QQ plot. I've translated the labels, though, to be in percentiles, because I think more people would understand that than a measure of the number of standard deviations from the median. But look at the difference here. And here, let me actually refresh those points. So we are dropping the extra boxes. Actually, no, maybe I should have kept those there, because they were accurate for the display time. But you can see how much different that theoretical line is. I mean, the slope, oh man, I mean, this was 0.5 before, with even wider, with a wider range, and this was 0.4, I think, but now it's 0.13. Because look at the turn to outliers is happening over here. Turn to outliers up here is happening right here. So this graph, I think, is incredibly important because it gives so much context to the percentiles. So yeah, let's come back to here. So a lot of places they will just, give you like the mean. I'll turn out the median as well. The mean and the 99% highs for me, the 1% lows for them. Go back to that. So now this data corresponds. It's the same data. But they'll just say that and be like, ooh, yes, we had a mean of 110, but that 1% low was at 60. That's a huge range. That's not good. Now, as I already explained, display time was very different, so it's that's not necessarily great to use. But it's still, if you look at this graph, you can see, oh, that 1% low, 99% high because it's frame time instead of frame rate, 1% low is not appropriate to use. You're already you are past the turn towards the outliers. This is another turn towards outliers, and it's a lot easier to see what I mean by saying a turn. You also see it here, and it's kind of up here, though this is, like, the 1% is in the turn. It's a long turn. But it's in it, whereas here, man, you'd have to... Let's try to pull this down. Okay, so about 3% here. This is a very nonlinear scale, in case you didn't notice, because here we've got 0.9% of the data, and here we have 49% of the data. Those lengths aren't quite that dissimilar. But we're going from about 4% to 95%. So actually, if we were to use, instead of 1% lows, 5% lows, that would be more appropriate for this. But 1% low, no, because you already had that turn. And actually, we can actually pull this in a little bit further. Let's do about there, and let's make this a flat 95. You can actually pull it in a little bit further here. And let's just skip ahead. There we go. So yeah, that's a bit better. But this is still, the center 90%, 90.5% of the data. So this is very representative. But you had to pull in that far to really see it, to really get into the bulk of the data, because here, as I was saying, you're already at the outlier. But with display time, it's fine once it finishes. Yeah. Oh, and it was 0.05, but it's still more than doubled just by using the frame time. That's a huge difference. And is why, it's very important for somebody like me who works with this data to be familiar with, hey, there is such a difference between those two values and what to look for in the graphs. I mean, pull back to the frame time, be able to look at it and be like, ooh, that doesn't make sense. And also to know when I collected the data, that was not the experience I had. I did not have the stutter that this is about to show. Well, imply. The consecutive difference graphs are actually, that you expect to be stutter. And here, I made this graph, I designed this graph to tell us about stutter. I define stutter as a sudden, significant change in frame time between one frame and the next. So consecutive frame time difference, when that's really great, that's really large, it's a stutter. And it's going to be more pronounced when the value is lower. Sorry, when the frame time itself is lower. It's like, just need this to redraw. Because this is still the display. Yeah. It's like that's, you're really going to feel a lot of this. And it's like, that is not what my experience was, so it was a good thing that I went in and decided, hey, let's see what the display time is. And I will be showing that stuff in the review. That is my intention. I already made the graph. So, let's actually, so this is a step graph. Instead of points, these are points. So the lines are basically only horizontal and vertical movements. It helps to show off changes in values, and it's, come on, there we go. Kept trying to double click to reset the zoom, but it was accidentally dragging. But yeah, that looks terrible, but was not at all what I expected. All right, I'm just trying to think. Are there any other values with throwing in here? I don't really think so. But yeah, I do just want to point out again, this was Dolmen with an RX 580 at the epic quality setting. There are no higher settings unless you turn up the resolution. So there is plenty of headroom for performance, even on the RX 580. I could see, 1440p, it should definitely be able to do that. Just my guessing. I don't have the experience to really say that with true confidence, but this looks very promising for that. I don't know how 4K would be, but you do have Fidelity FX Super Resolution, so you might be able to negotiate that well enough to get a good 4K experience out of the 580, and have it still look good. But yeah. Well, that's all. I just wanted to go through this stuff. You take the time to cover it all in commentary, not just in writing, have the interaction there. And I hope you found it interesting, even if it was a half hour of your time. And yeah, see you next